A big hello to everyone who is logging in for today's Disturbance in the Deep webinar. We're going to give it another 2 minutes or so to let more people log in, and then we'll get underway. While we're giving it 1 more minute for folks to log in, please feel free to use the chat function to share where you're zooming in from today, what organization you were with, if you would like to share that. And if you'd like a fun icebreaker, please feel free to drop in an ocean-themed song into the chat that I could have used as intro music during this moment while we're looking at the pretty poster. All right, and while you're doing that, it is 3 past the hour, and I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you very much for coming tonight. Well, tonight my time from good afternoon and good evening, or good morning from wherever you might be logging in from. That's one of the parts of the magic of Zoom, is that we get to bring people together from all across the globe in a way which is not dissimilar to the ocean. But anyhow, welcome to Disturbance in the Deep, a rights-based and values-based approach to deep sea conservation. This is a virtual side event of the third UN Ocean Conference, also referred to as UNOC 3. I'm Blair Nelsen, Executive Director of Waterspirit and UN-NGO representative for the Congregation of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Peace. This event is co-sponsored by the NGO Mining Working Group and its constituent members, including Maryknoll Fathers and Brothers, Maryknoll Sisters, Mercy International Association, the Temple of Understanding, and the Presbyterian Church of the USA. The NGO Mining Working Group is an NGO coalition that, in partnership with our members and affected local communities, advocates at and through the United Nations for human and environmental rights as related to extractive industries. The Mining Working Group addresses unjust and unsustainable extractive practices and policies through the lens of the rights of local communities, Indigenous peoples, and the earth. Many of the issues that we will be discussing during the next hour and a half are explored on the Mining Working Group's website, which you are invited to visit at www.miningwg.com. Please note that this event is being recorded and will be made available online afterwards. We ask you to keep yourselves on mute if you are not speaking, either presenting or later on asking a question during our Q&A and discussion portion. You are warmly invited to add questions to the chat at any time. And while we have an amazing lineup of 3 speakers coming up today, please note that slightly unusually, we will have a break for some questions and answers after our first 2 speakers, before our third one has an opportunity to log on. Now, before we dive into the portion with our very, very special guests, we will begin this event in the same way that we begin all of our Mining Working Group meetings, by holding a minute of silence for all of the communities impacted by extractive industries. Please join me now. Thank you, everyone. On this webinar, we are lucky to have a lineup of very powerful speakers ready to share more about deep sea mining and the risks it poses. I was just joking around with our first speaker earlier that for the past few years, the Mining Working Group has been in the habit of hosting a virtual side event on the topic of deep sea mining. And this is a tradition I cannot wait to see end. But it is now my pleasure to introduce Andy Whitmore. Andy Whitmore is Finance Advocacy Officer of the Deep Sea Mining Campaign. Andy has worked on the issues of mining and affected communities since becoming a founder member of the Mine Watch Collective in the late 1980s. He also helped found London Mining Network, where he is currently co-chair of the organization, and was managing editor of the Mines and Communities websites. Andy has an MA in Development Studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, and is the author of A Material Transition and Unearthing Justice, a Global Approach to Transition Minerals, as well as various articles on similar issues. Andy, you are most warmly welcome. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Blair. Much appreciated. And thank you. That's a very great introduction. Also, just to say, I'm known, obviously, Andy Whitmore is my name, but I'm also known as Whit. That's how Bobbi-Jo knows me. So if anyone, if you hear that, that is referring to me. So hopefully you can see my screen now. As mentioned, I work for the Deep Sea Mining Campaign. So I will move on to the slide, which explains a little bit more about the organization. We were founded in 2011, which makes us, in terms of deep sea mining, absolutely ancient. We are definitely the oldest of the single issue groups around deep sea mining. And we founded specifically to work in solidarity with Papua New Guinean communities, because the first mine that was ever going to happen was going to be in Papua New Guinean territorial waters. So we worked with the local communities to amplify their voices, to stop it in solidarity. And all of the areas of our work kind of come out of that still. So we've got three key areas of work, one of which is community solidarity, particularly around the Pacific, one of which is working with scientists and trying to popularize the science around deep sea mining. And the third is the area I'm working on, as mentioned, which is around finance. It's basically explaining the risk of deep sea mining to financiers. Though oddly enough, my presentation is primarily around a sort of 101 on deep sea mining. So I apologize for those who know a great deal on deep sea mining, but kind of have to start off by leveling the playing field a bit. But certainly within questions, I'm sure we can get on to more in depth on certain parts of the presentation. So this is a few of the reports that we've produced over the years, covering those different areas, but also to note at the top, there are some of the organizations we work with, and probably the main one to point out is we're a member of the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition, which is the main umbrella group working on deep sea mining at the moment. So generally then, the key questions are, what is deep sea mining? So again, I did say I go for the basic 101. So obviously it's about mining. Generally, deep sea is described as anything below 200 meters. There are generally three, there are actually more, but three types of mining that are progressing at the moment or could progress, each situated in different environments. The first is seafloor massive sulfides or hydrothermal vents, which is basically underwater volcanoes where metal has built up around the volcanic vents. The second is cobalt-rich crusts, which are basically on sort of underwater seamounts, mountain ranges, where metal has precipitated, has grown basically on the crusts over years. And the third, which is the area that most people are, or most companies are interested in at the moment, is polymetallic, sometimes called manganese nodules, which are these, I call them lumps of coal. I think people often refer to them as sort of apples or potatoes, but that gives you the idea of harvesting. So I think, they're more like lumps of coal that sit on the seabed. Also worth stressing, there are two different types of jurisdictions. So we're talking about what's happening within countries, effectively territorial waters, often called exclusive economic zones, and then what's happening in international waters or the high seas or the area when you're talking about the seabed. And last thing to stress is that there's no commercial mining has taken place yet. There's been large-scale test mining in various international and exclusive economic zones, but no mining has actually taken place. So in terms of the impacts, again, probably very aware of this, but just very briefly to go through it, all three types of mining that I mentioned are very similar in the process. With the case of the seafloor massive sulfides or crusts, you're talking about machines that are going to smash up the rocks. In the case of the polymetallic nodules, you're looking at machines that are going to basically hoover up the seabed, not just the minerals, but everything on the seabed. And then in all cases, it goes up a riser pipe to a support vessel on the surface, processed or sorted, and then any waste is sent back down through a return pipe to depths that aren't known yet. Again, they're experimenting with different depths in order to minimize the impact. However, there are likely to be impacts, certainly from the return pipes, but also particularly at the seafloor. Most of those are to do with the pollution that's driven up, particularly around what are known as plumes, which is basically dust clouds that can be at the surface and at the return pipe. But also you're talking about noise, which is a particular problem, and again, all the way up the return pipes, particularly the riser pipes, sorry, and light pollution. But also kind of importantly for us, I mean, there's a correct assumptions and concern around the environmental impact, but I mean it's also an economic risk, and you're talking about harming potentially other industries, including fishery and tourism, but also social impacts as well on communities. So then, to summarize in my very 10-minute presentation swift way, I think what makes deep sea mining unique, there are two elements to it that I think are essential to understand and create concern around it. The first is around the biodiversity loss, which will, as this 2017 report shows, will be definite. There will be biodiversity loss. That's irrefutable. But what's important is just how little is known of what that loss is going to be. And that's because we're still discovering what's down there. We're still discovering the interconnectivity between life, both on the seabed and further up the water columns. And I can point particularly towards a report that's linked here from Diva Amon and various other scientists that tried to look at the assessment of the scientific gaps. And they're huge. I mean, basically, we know less. The unknown unknowns are far greater than any of the equivalents, to use that phrase. And then, so that's one. Then that's allied with the fact that the time scales that we're working on are so much larger than anything that's dealt with on land. So you basically, the picture here is from one of the first, the Driscoll experiments, one of the first experiments that was done to try and measure impact, where they dragged a sledge across the seabed. This is taken over 30 years later. As you'll see, the impacts are, you can still see where the impact was made. The return of life is limited. There have been a few more papers written recently, perhaps a little bit more understanding that there may be recovery, but in general, the scientific consensus is that the recovery of life at the moment isn't on the scales of the experiments we've done, which again is an argument that we need more time to understand. And the picture here is one of the scale models of the polymetallic nodule hoovering machines, this one from GSR. So there, very briefly on what could be mined and where. So generally speaking, we're talking about deposits that are all over the oceans. There's a focus, this map shows the Pacific Ocean as the central point, because I think from deep sea mining, that's correct. It really is the focus of it. Generally speaking, polymetallic nodules tend more to be in international waters. Cobalt-rich crust a bit mixed, and the sulfides tends more to be in territorial waters, but there's no clear definition of that, and you'll see they're all mixed up. Particularly important is the Cohen-Clipperton zone, which is highlighted here. That's where most of the polymetallic nodules are. That's where most of the international licenses to mine are. And you'll see it's a huge area. I mean, it's an area that, if you mapped it out, pretty much covers the same size. It was the length, the same width as the United States. So we're talking about a vast area here. I think it's 45 million kilometers. Then, in terms of jurisdictions and policy, I mentioned the two jurisdictions. This is mainly focused on what happens on the international. So here, everything is governed by the UN Convention on Law of the Sea, which set up the International Seaways Authority. The ISA now has 170 countries, including the EU. As you probably know, there are ongoing negotiations to complete the mining codes. So this is basically, there are rules for the exploration work, but no rules for exploitation, no rules for mining agreed. Allegedly, they're pushing to finish this November. In practice, I think that's not going to happen, but we can come back to talk about that a bit more. Yeah, it's been slow because there has been a constant to and fro between some states that want to move more quickly and others that are more cautious. Then I think it's also worth stressing that in June 2021, the country of Nauru notified that it was intended to mine anyway. There is an obscure rule under the provisions that's known as the 2-year rule, which basically meant that Nauru, when it triggered it, they basically could start mining within 2 years, regardless of the state of the regulations. That came to be in 2023. However, in practice, they haven't been able to move forward because obviously without rules completed, it's not clear how that's going to work. But the company involved, the metals company, have been threatening to apply. They're still sort of threatening to apply in June 2025, but in the meantime, they have sidestepped that and unilaterally decided to apply through the United States. And Bobbi-Jo may talk more to that later, but I'm happy to talk a bit more in the questions if necessary, because I'm sure that's of interest to everyone. It's certainly one of the major bits of news at the moment. But also worth stressing, just in the EEZs, there are a number of states that push into mining their own waters. Papua New Guinea still, unbelievably, after their experience earlier. Japan, Cook Islands, Norway, and the USA, because the recent Trump executive orders focused on the continental shelf territorial waters of the US. So very quickly, in terms of who's engaged, I mean, there's a number of different companies, and this slide, which hopefully you can see, attempts to kind of map out some of those players. It's got the oversight and regulation at the top, but the bottom two tiers are the companies involved. Of those, what we call the pure plays, the ones who are mainly focused on mining, are in the center, in the sort of like almost the middle. And then you've got at the bottom these collector service contractors as well, that I would say are also the kind of pure plays. So it's the license holders, operators, collector service contractors. Pretty much everyone else there is secondarily supporting the industry. So most of our focus is around stopping those license holders and collector service contractors. But also, again, we are focused where possible on the others who are enabling the industry, if you will. And then very quick slide again on why would we need deep sea mining, what the arguments are. I mean, the industry has long used arguments that I believe we've effectively refuted, but they still keep coming. One is that it's more environmentally friendly than terrestrial mining. Again, we'll get into it in questions, but I mean, first of all, it's not comparable. And even if you then start to compare it, there are reasons that very often deep sea mining is more impactful, but not noted. But I would refer to this European Academy Science Advisory Council publication, which really does a good job from a scientific point of view, looking at the papers and explaining kind of why that isn't the case. There's been an argument about the need for the transition, renewable energy transition. That I think that's been completely refuted. But also, interestingly, with, for instance, the switch towards the US mining, the arguments are now becoming about security. They're becoming about, we need to mine because we need to stop China controlling elements. So it's fascinating to me how, the arguments have been, we must mine soon. We must have deep sea mining because we need it for the energy transition. And then you can almost turn those arguments, the opposite argument, on the head of a pin. And yet they still vehemently make this, opposite arguments, but still with the same, idea that we need the deep sea mining. I mean, we can refute those as well, but the separate arguments really. And then, one of them is just, and then the last thing is to say, I mean, they just basically say it's only going to be small, we're only want 1% of the seabed. Well, I mean, 1% of the seabed is huge. Within the CCZ, which is covered in licenses, the average license is about 8,500 kilometers squared. So, I mean, we're talking huge areas. And unlike terrestrial mining, they're huge areas that will actually be mined. I mean, so it's more equivalent to strip mining than in terms of terrestrial mining than anything else. And then I'll finish with one slide just to say, I think because of all of this, there's growing opposition. So one of the key parts of the growing opposition is that as of today, because more countries have just today at the United Nations Ocean Conference come out for a moratorium, we now have 37 countries. The slide said 36, because I updated it this afternoon. But in between updating it, the Marshall Islands have now announced. So well done, Marshall Islands, and well done, Slovenia, Cyprus, and Latvia, who all announced today. So it's good timing. And I'm sure by the end of the conference, we'll have more. So, but I mean, they're not alone. I mean, the EU has actually at UNOC, the EU has reconfirmed its position around deep sea mining. France at UNOC has reconfirmed position around the ban. Thankfully, Macron mentioned it again today. Calls for ban with the Pacific Civil Society, and hopefully the Reverend James will talk to that as well. I think particularly we support Pacific Blue Line, where it's communities and community-based organizations who are talking out. It's now over 900, I think it's 944 marine scientists who've signed up calling for a pause. Plenty of business actors, including financiers, which is what I would normally talk to, but here are some of the major corporations at this website on Stop Deep Seabed Mining. And then finally, the Congress of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature back in 2021, which is made up of governments and NGOs, voted in favor of moratorium. So I think the concern I mentioned, for the reasons, well, some of the reasons I've had time to mention, it definitely coming through. And I suspect during the rest of the UNOC conference, more solidarity statements and more countries will come out, and probably organizations as well. In fact, two more financiers, French financiers, have both committed to avoiding deep sea mining as well over the last few days at the Tide Monaco meeting. Great. So I think that's everything from me, but I'm sure we'll come back to plenty of other points during the questions. Thanks.
Whit, thank you for that fantastic and comprehensive overview of a little bit of everything we needed to know: what deep sea mining is, what's at stake, what's the history of this movement over the past few years, and where the campaign is at now. It's so exciting to hear that as of an hour ago, we're up to 37 countries that have said no to deep sea mining. So thank you so much for giving us that briefing. Now, you mentioned the Reverend James Bhagwan. He, in fact, would be our next speaker in our panel that brings together scientific and faith-based voices to demonstrate this unity in our call to action to understand and ban deep sea mining. But unfortunately, I'm checking our participant list. It looks like the time difference between where we're hosting this webinar from and where Reverend Bhagwan is based in the Pacific was just a little too much. So unfortunately, we are going to have to turn to his pre-recorded message tonight. However, I want to assure you that any questions that you add to the chat that you would like to make sure reach Reverend Bhagwan will in fact do so after this event. We'll save them, we'll send them his way. And again, for all of our guests, anytime you have questions or comments, just go ahead and add them in the chat and we'll get to them as we are able. Now, our second speaker who shared this pre-recorded message is Reverend James Bhagwan. He is in his second term as Secretary General of the Pacific Conference of Churches, the peak ecumenical body for the Oceania region, and comprising 36 national denominations and 11 national councils of churches across 20 Pacific Island states and colonized territories. The PCC is a member of the Pacific Blue Line, a civil society-led movement against deep sea mining. And with that, I will share my screen and Reverend Bhagwan will take it away. Oh, just as soon as Zoom wants to show me everything that I wanted to show me. One moment, folks.
Nisambula Vinaka and warm Pacific greetings to you all. It's early Tuesday morning here, and it is my pleasure to join you virtually for this important gathering. I join you today not as an academic scientist, but as a pastor and a spiritual practitioner. As General Secretary of the Pacific Conference of Churches, I speak on behalf of faith communities across the vastness of the blue Pacific continent, the liquid continent which covers more than a quarter of this planet, from the volcanic peaks of Papua New Guinea to the low-lying atolls of Tuvalu and Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, and from the highlands of Viti Levu to the deep ocean trenches that lie beneath us, from Maui Nui to Kanaki to Aotearoa and all the way up to Hawaii. This is our Pacific blue continent. My roots are in the Vanua, and the relationships of belonging that are spiritual, cultural, and ecological. As an adopted son of the district of Nodo in the Delta province, Rewa in Fiji, I come from a people whose sacred totems remind us that we are never separate from creation. The Mbelo, the heron, the Ngaka, the barred garfish, the Dongo, the black mangrove, and my spiritual guardian, the Vonu, or the turtle, are not just symbols, they are kin, they are teachers, and they're reminders of our interdependence and of our responsibility, and particularly for us, with these sacred totems of our deep relationship with the ocean. We are not stewards of the ocean, we are its custodians, we are its guardians, not owners, but part of it, bound not by domination, but by reciprocity, by reverence and responsibility. And our role is not to manage the ocean for human benefit, but to protect it from human exploitation. This third UN conference takes place amid intensifying calls for deep sea mining. And we must be honest, DSM is being driven not by the urgency of climate justice, but by geopolitical and economic interests. The rhetoric has shifted from renewables to military readiness. And both narratives, renewable energy and military preparedness, dangerously ignore the need for a precautionary pause. The Pacific, home to some of the richest biodiversity in the ocean, is being targeted once again as a frontier for extraction. But the ocean is not a mare nullius, an empty sea willing to be ready to be claimed, to be owned, or to be consumed. As indigenous theologians and cultural leaders have said, the ocean is not territory, it is relationship. And this is why we must listen to those indigenous leaders, such as the royal family of Tonga, who have called for whales to be granted personhood. And this is why we must reject the false promises of DSM. Today, I would like to share the words of the Pacific Blue Line, which many of us across this liquid continent hold, uniting Pacific civil society, Pacific faith leaders, scientists, and communities in a firm stance that deep sea mining is not needed, not wanted, and not consented. The ocean is the living blue heart of our planet. It sustains not only biodiversity, but identity and well-being for millions of Pacific peoples. For millennia, our ancestors were custodians of the sea, their knowledge systems expressed in customary bans of fishing. Seasonal closures and sacred relationships were not backward, but forward-looking. They acted within the well-being of future generations in mind. And now is our time to carry that responsibility. Deep sea mining is a new and dangerous form of extractivism. Even at its experimental stage, it's already disrupting communities threatening food systems, damaging ecosystems, and violating cultural rights. It is presented as safe, but we know that sediment plumes, toxic waste, and habitat destruction carry irreversible consequences. Scientists warn of biodiversity loss, methane releases, and cascading impacts across the oceanic carbon cycle. Let us not repeat the mistakes of land-based mining. I've often said that you can see the scars of extractivism on the land. Trees cut down and deforested. There are scars across the green and brown as land is mined. But it's hard to see the scars under the sea. Our Pacific histories in Banaba, Bougainville, Nauru, and beyond reveal to us that these projects bring profit for corporations and suffering for people. And the same story is now being retold, but in the deep. So let us be clear, there is no free, prior, and informed consent from indigenous Pacific communities for DSM, not within national jurisdictions and certainly not in international waters. And no amount of financial incentive can erase this truth. We call for a total ban on deep sea mining, not just a moratorium, not just regulation, a total ban. And let us remember this ocean is already under immense stress from warming, acidification, overfishing, plastics, and pollution. Introducing new, untested, large-scale extractive industry into the most fragile and least understood ecosystems on Earth is not progress. It is recklessness. Proponents of DSM claim it is needed for green technology, but this is a dangerous greenwashing narrative. Minerals can be sourced from recycling, reuse, ethical innovation, and circular economies. We do not have to destroy the ocean to save the planet. As churches and people of faith are not neutral, we are called to take a stand, to be voices for life, not death, to protect the sacred from commodification, and to speak out for the vulnerable, not only among humanity, but among all creation. Jesus said, "Whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me." And today, the least of these may be the voiceless creatures of the deep, the sacred whales, coral, and microorganisms that hold the mysteries of life itself. It may be the future generations whose seas are being sold before they are born. It may be indigenous communities whose knowledge is ignored while the sacred ocean is threatened. Let us be guardians. Let us be those who stood firm. Let us stand and say together, no to deep sea mining, yes to life, yes to the ocean, yes to our common future. We are the ocean. In its preservation, we are preserved. Vinaka Vakalevu, and may peace be upon our ocean and all who depend on her.
Oh, there were so many little moments from Reverend Bhagwan's message that I just wanted to capture and get down fast enough. We are the ocean. The ocean is not territory, it is relationship. The ocean is the blue heart of the world. Very, very powerful testimony from the Pacific. So thank you, Reverend Bhagwan. Even though you're unable to be here in person, your message was received very powerfully. And at this time, I'm very happy to share that our third speaker has actually been able to join us a little bit earlier. So I am going to go ahead and skip ahead in the program and introduce Bobbi-Jo Dobush to our event. She is an environmental attorney and expert on the financial and liability risks posed by deep sea mining. She practiced law for a decade with a global firm where she counseled clients on climate regulations, sustainability, financing of renewables, and carbon markets. Bobbi-Jo advises civil society, government, investors, and philanthropies on DSM. She aspires to make ocean science, law, and policy accessible. And Bobbi-Jo is fluent in Spanish, has a degree in visual arts, and loves ocean sports, adventure, books, and salsa, the condiment. Thank you so much for being here. Take it away.
Hello, and thank you so much for having me. I was very pleased to be able to catch, I think, maybe the last 75% of Wit's presentation and to listen to the video of the Reverend, which was, I also wrote down the ocean is relationship, not territory. It was very powerful. I'm really happy to be here with this group. I am going to attempt to share my screen from Google Slides, so just give me 1 second and then I will jump right into it. Do you all see that slide? Oh, it's the wrong, I think it's the wrong one cover sheet, but that's okay. We'll just ignore that and jump right into it. Um, all right. So I'm going to talk about all the cynical stuff about seabed mining. And I know Whit talked about some of this, and Whit and I collaborate on these issues a lot. So I'm glad I was able to catch what he said. So I'll try not to overlap very much. But I think probably in this crowd, I don't need to say that there are people all over the world doing incredible work on the cultural and environmental reasons that we don't need to start a new extractive frontier. Um, but I want to talk a little bit more today about how even, we joke sometimes that even for oligarchs that don't have ESG boards and, are misanthropes and don't care about the environment, it doesn't seem there's much there in the business case for DSM. So even for folks that don't care about the things that many of us probably share as common values, I think there are some really big outstanding questions about whether or not there's even a there for the investment case. And of course, I'm not, not an investment professional. This isn't advice and it's not legal advice, but just there are questions that need to be answered, which I believe are the basic questions. That we don't have the answers to, or the answers make it seem like this is not a great deal. We're going to talk about that, the potential risks and liabilities related to, really focused on the finance and legal liabilities. And then I will give a really short update on what's going on with the United States, which is a little bit kind of through a wrench in some of the dynamics of seabed mining globally as well. So, um, as we heard from both of our two presenters, the narrative has changed from a nodule on the seabed is like a battery in a rock, as if you were just going to plop it into your electric car and drive off into the sunset. But although behind closed doors, that narrative has largely been abandoned, at least in the United States, for a mineral security narrative. This slide focuses a lot on why the EV narrative is false, but a lot of this goes for the mineral security and defense also. Um, it's not just seabed miners, but everybody in the mineral space has realized that cobalt and nickel are problematic, both from, sourcing. To this group more than anybody else. I don't have to belabor that point. There is a false equivalence often given by seabed miners, like, oh, well, if you don't support seabed mining, then you support child labor and rainforest deforestation. And there are so many, logical gaps in that argument. But just talking about, we'll talk about that a little bit more after, but just talking about what we have in the nodule, which are the polymetallic nodules on the seafloor, are cobalt, nickel, copper, and manganese. Copper and manganese are plentiful. There are many problems with mining them, but it's not that they're rare, and they're also not a cost driving factor. So when companies that are pitching seabed mining talk about this, they always talk about cobalt and nickel. And as you will know, the prices are down on both of those metals. And also, seabed mining would pretty much be the most expensive way to get them if you wanted them. Something that I feel like raises the eyebrows of folks that I talk to that aren't in this, don't ever do anything related to mining and are maybe more in an ocean space, is that there is no lithium, no one is trying to source lithium from the seabed. And at least where I am in the US, it's lithium that's the driving factor in all of these conversations about minerals and decarbonization. So I think it's just worth putting that out there at the outset. This isn't gonna, alleviate any of our concerns around lithium. The technical challenges. I won't belabor this, but I think we can just all agree that doing an extractive industry much farther into the ocean than the deepest oil and gas has ever gone. We've only put like ROVs down this for a small amount of time at a time. Sorry, a lot of background noise. But we just like the tech isn't there. And when companies talk about the successful trials, like the metals company belabors this really successful trial it had. It picked up 3,000 tons of nodules in 2 months. That's what they say they're going to do like every hour. And something we don't talk about, although it's public knowledge, is that they actually collected 4,500 tons of nodules. So why didn't they bring up the other 1,500? Are they sitting in a pile in the ocean where they're not able to? And these are some stills from a video that was leaked by a scientist on the research ship that accompanied the All Seas vessel that they used, the Hidden Gem. And it shows like the nodule spinner broke and it was spinning out of control and like putting the sediment, what would be in the sediment plume, just off the side of the boat. And that wasn't reported for 16 days, and it was only reported after the scientists leaked it. I bet Whit spoke to this, but I'll just say that you don't have to take my word for it. I'm not a banker. I'm not in investments, but all of these, in addition to the countries and the banks, all of these like multilateral investment institutions think that there's, seabed mining. They're cautioning against investing in it or absolutely excluding it, and I think that, it's become pretty well established that you can't greenwash this anymore. It's not sustainable. From my lawyer hat perspective, I always want to talk about like there's a dollar factor to these uncertainties and to these liabilities. In my previous world when I worked in corporate law, if you're a giant company and you're a private equity firm and you're thinking about buying a company, you would be looking at all of their liabilities and you would try to be putting a price tag on them to see if it was still worth buying it, for example. And, I think that from a lawyer perspective, the worst thing is uncertainty. Even major risk can be priced. And, that's what insurers do too. And the thing is, these unknowns make it so difficult to even evaluate from a cost perspective how much this would cost. Planet Tracker did a report estimating that restoring only 10% of the 500,000 square kilometers that might ultimately be mined in the Pacific would cost US $50 billion. That said, scientists say it's impossible to restore the deep ocean because it operates on completely non-human timescales. We can't, and you can't say tit for tat, like you can't mitigate by offsets and putting aside deep ocean in other places because we're realizing that the species structure is so complicated. There's so much we don't know, and there are all these like endemic areas. Um, you know, this is a conversation in itself, but seabed mining is pretty obviously incompatible with many of the other biodiversity, ocean, and climate commitments that countries have made, or regionally or globally. And it's often would be in contrast to local laws or national laws as well. And then there's just imagine all the things that could go wrong. Imagine fisheries, which would be one that where the economics are obvious. If seabed mining sediment plumes, or Impossible Metals wants to bring all these robots up and down in a fleet, if they started messing with fisheries or fish behavior or migratory species like whales or migratory species like tuna, there could be a cost associated with that. And again, as a lawyer, like where would be the jurisdiction? Could you go to international courts? Like where would, there's so many unknowns. But on the flip side, we have so little to gain. Again, yeah, threatens fisheries. And right now, coming back to the US, the US administration currently has just attempted to open up a wide swath of protected area to fishing, and they claim to really care about fishers and food security, but that's incompatible with seabed mining. And the RFMOs, the regional fisheries management organizations, which, have member states and govern parts of the high seas, they are starting to look into what seabed mining might mean for them as well. Um, as you well know, there are human rights and indigenous right holders aspects to this. UCH stands for Underwater Cultural Heritage. There are UNESCO conventions on cultural heritage, underwater cultural heritage, and intangible cultural heritage. And these are conversations that I've been going to Kingston to the Seabed Authority meetings for maybe like 4 years now. And they're conversations that are happening now. And there are many like indigenous rights stakeholders who appear in Kingston and speak on their own behalf and say we don't consent to this. And this conversation was just not really happening 5 years ago. So it's really, it when things seem very doom and gloom, at least we're having these conversations, and that is a step in the right direction. Briefly, I'm going to just speak about what's happening in the States. Two things are happening in parallel in the United States. An executive order came out supporting seabed mining, and there are kind of two processes. There is, and I made this little chart just to help my own self keep it straight. The first one is all about within the US EEZ. There's this guy, Oliver Gunasakara. He runs a company called Impossible Metals. It's a privately held company. They have applied through the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management in the US to mine outside of American Samoa, and they've talked about Hawaii as well. And that would be like, imagine at the very reaches of the US EEZ, the American Samoa location is almost in the Cook Islands. It's right there where the EEZs touch. And then the one you may have heard more about, the metals company, that's Jared Barron right there. He's their CEO. He was also the CEO of Nautilus, the one associated with all the loss for Papua New Guinea. He his company has applied to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration to mine in the international high seas, the area, exactly the license areas he holds through Nauru and Tonga. Nauru, well, we could have a long conversation about who's the company, what are the subsidiaries, how does this all mean? And those conversations are actually happening a lot, but it's for the same places he has under the ISA, plus some. And so both of those are very, very early procedure. There's going to be a lot of opportunity for public comment, and the US, civil society is tracking this very closely. Um, just to be clear, the United States never ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, but there's an international law, there's something called customary international law that if you kind of accept something and act like it and act in accordance with it, you are bound by it unless you persistently object. It wasn't funny, I'm such a nerd. A legal article came out recently where somebody called them like a persistent acceptor. They're not a persistent objector, the United States, to these rules. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea governs much more than seabed mining. It's your maritime boundaries. It's the right of passage for cargo ships through other states' EEZs. The US relies on this a lot. And they have not persistently objected to what's happening at the ISA. They attend every meeting and they participate as an observer. So it seems like the United States is still making the argument that they're not bound by this part of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and it's okay for them to license the metals company to mine in those same areas. But the United States is alone in thinking this. So it also begs the question, what does the US even think they're going to get out of this? TMC is a Canadian company. They have a CEO from Australia who files taxes in Dubai. I'm not really sure where and the company is asking the United States for subsidies. So I'm really not sure what the US believes they may have to gain. And with that, I will stop, and I'm happy to answer questions, and I'm especially happy to do so alongside Whit. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bobbi-Jo. I'm sure many of us on the call are used to hearing a kind of dichotomy between environment or economy, as if, you have to pick one or the other, or that they're constantly in tension. So it's fascinating that in the deep sea mining case, there's not even that economic justification behind it. So thank you for walking us through some more of those details, as well as updates as to where the campaign is at in the United States. Whew. As ED of a US-based nonprofit, I can feel, the being tasked to, okay, how are we going to hold our administration to task at this time? So lots of food for thought to think about later. Before we move on to questions, I'm going to take just a few minutes to bring in a little bit of the work of the mining working group, and then we'll turn over to some of these great questions that we're getting in the chat and let all of our speakers take a crack at them. So one moment to bring back up my slides. Okay. So the NGO Mining Working Group uses a human rights framework to protect water, people, and the community of life from the harmful ravages of the mining industry. And the Mining Working Group has developed a rights-based litmus test to guide our analysis and advocacy when assessing resource extraction policies in the context of sustainable development. This 4-step litmus test was developed by the coalition members in 2012 and remains agile and relevant today. And again, this litmus test is available on the NGO Mining Working Group's website. There's a QR code link there. And here are the 4 steps. First off, do no harm. This step examines the state's obligation to respect and protect. To determine whether an extractive project is doing no harm, we ask ourselves inquiry questions like, can this project be carried out without violating human rights, Earth's rights, and Indigenous peoples' rights, including free, prior, and informed consent? Step 2, realizing rights. Building off of step 1, step 2 asks us to evaluate state's obligation to promote and fulfill. We ask questions like, does the local community experience greater enjoyment of their human rights as a result of this extractive project? Does the project prioritize guaranteeing the human rights of the most marginalized groups? Step 3, participation and accountability. States must guarantee participation and access to justice. In step 3, the litmus test requires us to ask, does this project guarantee effective, meaningful, and equitable participation by impacted peoples, particularly the most marginalized peoples who would be impacted, including, but not limited to, Indigenous peoples and local communities, overburdened communities, and those experiencing environmental injustices already, and impoverished communities? Are human and environmental rights defenders guaranteed protections in the exercise of their rights? And is remedy guaranteed in the event that these rights are violated and harm occurs? And finally, step 4, sustainability. States are obligated to guarantee the rights of future generations. This obligation has gained primacy in the past 3 years, in particular, since the UNGA passage of the right to a healthy environment in 2022. The litmus test asks, does this project further or hinder the ability of future generations to enjoy and express their environmental and human rights? The litmus test is simple and clear. If a project, law, or initiative does not pass this litmus test, it represents an unacceptable risk of harm and cannot be allowed to proceed in good moral conscience. On step after step, deep sea mining fails this test. Therefore, we have a moral obligation to enact our values of caring for nature by taking action to stop it in its tracks. Now, I just want to share a couple of visuals from this first day of the conference and from a little bit of the pre-work as well, to show you that deep sea mining remains fresh on the forefront of the conversation here in Nice, France. So this image on your screen before you is a still from the Blue March. This was a civil society march held along the ocean front on the 7th. So this was 2 days ago. And stopping the machine, saying no to deep sea mining was one of the clear cries from the 1,000 or so people who were present marching along the waterfront. It was exciting for me to be back at this Blue March and to see that message come through again. I was at the Blue March in Lisbon in 2022, and deep sea mining was a real point of coalescence for civil society, and we remain united in our calls. This morning during the opening plenary, we heard a few instances of deep sea mining. Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, says that the deep sea cannot become the Wild West. And French President Emmanuel Macron reiterated their commitment to a moratorium on deep sea mining. It was very exciting back in 2022 when we came out of the UN Ocean Conference with 10 countries, including France, committing to a moratorium, and to see that as of today, we now have 37 on board. It's tremendous momentum in the right direction, but there's still a lot further to go. During the Ocean Action Panel on the deep sea ecosystems, I really thought that there was going to be more discussion of this issue. Unfortunately, I could only catch a couple of instances. For example, the Brazilian Minister for Environment and Climate, Marina Silva, mentioned that Brazil employs a precautionary approach to deep sea mining. Not exactly the words that I was looking for, although precaution is a part of it. And even though, Marina, I am one of your biggest fans, you could have taken that statement a little bit further. And then at an afternoon side event on ocean and climate, connecting the Paris goals to the upcoming climate COP in Belém do Pará, Brazil, we got to hear again from Minister Marina Silva and a number of other speakers. But of importance to bring in here was that this talk also included the International Seabed Authority's Secretary General, Letícia Reis de Carvalho. And she shared some remarks that on the surface were beautiful. She thanked her former boss and mentor, Marina da Silva. She asked, what will we do? What is necessary for the health of future generations? And then she affirmed, we will do it. She assured the audience that the deep sea does play a critical role in the carbon cycle, for example, in sequestering carbon. And she compared the emissions from deep sea mining to land-based mining. She insisted that we integrate the deep sea into all ocean climate biodiversity commitments. And, the question now is, Madam Secretary General, if your understanding of the deep sea and its importance, including in the carbon cycle, is so clear that you have the power, what are you going to do about it? So I'll leave us on that thought and that image. And now turn my attention to the chat, and I will invite our Zoom wranglers to spotlight our other two speakers, that whoever feels called to answer some of these questions is invited to do so. So the first question that we have in the chat: do extractive actors apply for permits to kill the sea life suctioned up, or do they get fines or penalties, or are states held accountable for increasing biodiversity loss, climate change, or loss of ocean integrity in any convention processes?
I can start.
Yeah, can I go first?
Okay. So we're leaving aside the states and focusing on the International Seabed Authority. Yes, there's something called a plan of work that's an application for a permit, and that's what Whit was saying. Nauru and the metals company have been kind of threatening the ISA with about applying for an application to. There are 36 or 35 to 37 current exploration permits that the ISA has issued all over the world, in the Pacific, but also the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic. But for exploitation, like commercial mineral exploitation, this one that TMC and NAR are threatening would be the first one. And so I guess, there are exploration permits where definitely sea life is killed in this exploration. Um, but do they get fines or penalties? So that's the problem. We don't have regulations yet. And the regulations are like a 300-page document right now with a lot of bracketed text, and bracketed meaning unagreed text. And it's not crossing T's and dotting I's. The regulations are far from, there was a paper that came out last year about the 36 major gaps in the regulations, and a lot of them are around these like liability issues. And there's been 10 years ago, probably now, or at least 6 or 7, there was a major liability working group convened in 8 papers. Hundreds of pages of papers came out on the liability issues, and they haven't been resolved. And I'll just say that until very recently, the economic model didn't have any natural capital costs in it, or, they weren't internalizing externalities. And that there have been in the last couple of years at the ISA some papers about the value of the ecosystem services and that have been commissioned, and that's all still in the works. But conversation again that wasn't even on the table 5 years ago. Wait, I don't know if they have more to add to that one.
I think that's great. I think you covered most of it. I mean, I would say the only thing to add, well, probably not the only thing, but the main thing to add, in terms of putting plans of work together, there's meant to be studies of what biodiversity is down there. They're meant to do baseline studies. They're meant to try and understand what the damage is going to be done. As noted, a lot of this both needs to be agreed in the code anyway, but then we need to see a lot more of the studies. But it's all too early in many ways to know just how bad the impact's going to be. But it's clear there is going to be impact, and it's also not 100% clear. I think one of the issues that makes deep sea mining so problematic is also monitoring the companies, is working out, whether they're holding to these attempts to minimize the impacts or not. Because, I mean, we've seen tailings dam failures where tailings dams have been audited by people who can walk up to it and check the base of it, and still, we've had collapses. So if we have that on terrestrial mining, how much worse, how much more difficult is it going to be if you're doing it down below? And the companies have come up with all this thing where they're going to use AI, and there's all sorts of kind of like wonderful sounding whiz bang technology. And some of what my colleague has been doing has been trying to expose that for what it is, which is basically kind of vague charlatanry to give this impression that there's going to be more monitoring than there actually is.
Thank you both. I would like to institute a new rule where every time anybody tells me what AI is going to do, they also have to tell me about the resources that are input into the system before it gives me these great, amazing outputs. And I'm thinking specifically of the freshwater water use. So linking SDG 6 and SDG 14 through AI on land and the ocean. Our next question in the chat seems to address some of the flaws in the UN system when trying to create, when trying to carry out this mandate to protect people and communities in the community of life, while also being a significant incentivizer of some of these technologies and systems that in fact lead to destruction in the first place. And the question as it's phrased in the chat is, how can we address systemic racism and discrimination within the UN system, such as the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, protection of Eurocentric based economic systems, seen in prioritization of financial shareholders and their pension systems invested in capital, while allocating the marine health created by past generations of Indigenous peoples to be held in trust for future generations of Indigenous peoples, to see these Eurocentric capitalist systems and to support future generations of capitalists. So I'm hearing in this question how to address some of those flaws in the UN system to in fact create more just systems, including economic systems that are in fact life honoring.
You want to go first again? I think as you kind of raised it anyway in your slideshow.
No, I mean, I think what I would say, and actually, I think you're probably closer to a lot of these systems, and probably as I was reading this in the chat, I was thinking many on this call might have better ideas than I would about the answer to this question. I think that it's become clear, like I said, that the Convention on Biological Diversity has spoken out against this, and I know a lot about the kind of how seabed mining would breach things, but I'm not probably best positioned to speak to how to fix these, but I will drop in the chat for everybody to check out or send around later too if it's more helpful. There recently a great paper came, a long fact sheet came out with four little papers in it called ISA 2.0 about like how can we start something really exciting, I think, like how can we start thinking about if we do get a global moratorium on seabed mining, what will the ISA look like? How can it really step into its power as a science organization? And how can we integrate the ISA in with BBNJ and into the UN system generally? Which really isn't the answer to your question about how to dismantle systemic racism in those organizations, which is a better question than the one I'm answering. But I will still share this ISA 2.0 because it's interesting and it thinks a lot about capacity building, like real capacity building that goes both ways and isn't just like, oh, we don't need this thing anymore, so we're going to give it to you and you're never going to be able to fix it if it breaks. And here's tech transfer points on my scorecard of technology transfer and capacity building. So it is thinking about these issues about how to kind of step out of this colonial framework of like, I will give you something now and you should be really grateful. But I probably doesn't go far enough, but it's a start. So I'd love to
Yeah.
hear from you, Whit, and anybody else,
Yeah.
actually.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I'm going to take it a little bit wider in the question first because we haven't sort of like discussed the kind of competing governance going on. So it's probably now a good time just to mention it, which is that, I mean, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, as Bobbi-Jo said, it kind of covers other areas than just mining. The mining part of it is very weird in truth. And it kind of goes on maybe to the next question will come. But I mean, it was basically created at a time when there was, developing countries were just saying, how do we try and even things up in terms of economy? And so we will come up with this idea that we'll privatize the seabed, and as part of that, at least this extraction will happen, and that developing countries in theory will get more out of it rather than just the US and Russia just claiming it and doing it anyway. And next question along kind of comes back to, well, how weird this is, the privatization of the seabed. But I think what's sort of on that ISA 2.0, and I think there's been a lot of pressure to rethink where the ISA is coming from. And I think there's been pressure for a couple of years now to have a more general discussion on what the purpose of the ISA is, mixed with a focus on mining, and whether it can have a general purpose which is wider towards seabed protection of the seabed. Linked into that is also the fact that you've got the recent High Seas Treaty, BBNJ, and so you kind of like, which again, to some extent competes, and that has a focus that's much more around protection of the environment, etc. So I think you kind of got these interesting competing points. What's often not competing, and it frustrates me, is the human rights mechanisms that come in. I mean, I think one of the things that's happened, one of the reasons that the ISA has shifted to some extent, some of it's been NGO public anger. A lot of it has been that increasingly Indigenous peoples themselves are participating in at the ISA meetings, which I think is very, very strong, and has brought cultural issues to the fore, which is absolutely great. So I think and I think Bobbi-Jo's worked with community and people on that, and it's been amazing, because I think it has shifted in the at least probably the last 5 years. It's shifted a lot of the narrative of what's happening within there. But I still think that the UN human rights mechanisms aren't taking enough of a notice of this, and aren't in bringing their viewpoint in. A couple of recent UN special rapporteurs reports, which are focused on transition minerals in general, have been strong on this. There is and this is more wearing my hat working on mining in general, but there is a statement that's in progress at the moment that will be a general sign-on that's focused on COP30, and is focused on transition minerals. And it's trying to set out, it's building on previous civil society statements on why we don't need more mining and how harm can be reduced. And within it, there is a proviso on deep sea mining that says, we don't need deep sea mining. But unfortunately, it's not for sharing yet. And when it is, hopefully we'll pass that around for signing on. But there are things happening, but I think, it is still frustrating to me. And I think people, things like the Convention on Elimination of Racial Discrimination, obviously you have these, the periodic reviews. And again, I think, we should be doing more to make sure in the periodic reviews that particularly the countries who are the home countries allegedly of these mining companies, like the metals company in Canada, are held up. And some of that's happening, but more can be done.
Thank you both. And your answers also started to pull in our third question in the chat. How do we keep the deep sea from becoming the next frontier for colonization? And thankfully, as we've seen on land as well, Indigenous peoples are there at the forefront of the decolonization process and really protecting the community of life for everybody. I do want to pull out the first part of the third question in the chat, even though you've both touched on this throughout your presentations, just to make it really clear for everybody on the call. When there are so many arguments against deep sea mining, scientific, moral and religious, economic, human rights based, why is it still moving forward? Why do they still think it's a good idea?
Great. Shall I go first on that? And I just want to finish off before I answer that. I'll really be quick, but because it leads on to the last thing I was saying, that one of the things for me that I blows my mind still around deep sea mining is how it's basically backdoor privatization of common land. And it's done, it's the way the treaty is set up is that, again, because it was built with this idea that developing countries would be somehow benefiting out of this, it says you can have this area of the seafloor, but it's still part of the common heritage of mankind. how the hell does that work? Yeah, well, it works through this weird mechanism they're trying to work out, that people will get compensated, that obviously when you practically get down to it, it's going to be really difficult to sort out. But it's at the end of the day, it is basically privatizing one of the last commons, and so we just need to be saying that more, and we need to be stopping that happening, because whether you've got some fancy clever mechanism that alleges it will compensate people, it doesn't. And also, what's really important in the shift from the narrative of energy transition, at least if the argument was we need these for batteries for the energy transition, you could say that benefits humankind. Where in the argument that we need this for fighter bombers, for missiles, where does that fit? And again, part of UNCLOS says that this is meant to have peaceful means. So again, it runs completely contrary to the spirit of what's intended there. So want to make that point before moving on to and then breathe, and then just before answering because why is it going ahead? Just because of the greed of people that want to make money, I would say, primarily. I mean, unfortunately, that's allied, particularly now, as we mentioned, with the concerns that governments have that they need these so-called critical minerals. And I think there are some issues around mineral criticality. Most of the time, they're poorly understood, and most of the time, the solutions to them. There was an article in the Financial Times today that I just was ridiculed in on social media, because the headline was, how do we deal with China's dominance? And the answer, funnily enough, the first answer was AI might provide a solution. I thought, you could tell a journalist who's thinking, I'm going to get clicks for this article because I put the two most zeitgeisty things together. Everyone's going to read this. Just think, and at the end, he kind of mentioned recycling, mentioned, innovation, battery innovation, but at no point did he mention, the whether we need these things, level of demand or anything. So I mean, it is crazy. It's driven by, in the same way we were saying, that rush. And I would argue in some ways, the whole opening up of the American executive order, that you can trace the lobbying that the metals company and others were doing. They paid lobbyists to go in, and it's coming good for them. So, in the same way it was mentioned earlier on, Bobbi-Jo, that Gerard Barron made money out of the failed Nautilus venture in Papua New Guinea. He exited at the right time. It's easy for people to make money out of this. Mining doesn't need to happen. They need to sell the idea that mining can happen. And that's increasingly what's happened. So these guys are selling an idea and making huge amounts of money. And the people who will lose out very much are likely to be their states that they're working with at the moment. Where is Nauru now that they're going to the US? And but let alone the rest of us, nature and the rest of humanity that will eventually have the costs externalized to them. I'll take a breath now. Sorry, Bobbi-Jo.
No way, I'm learning. Thank you. I will answer those questions kind of in an opposite order. I'll add what Whit just said, and then I wanted to make a comment about the kind of broader. So, I mean, I think when you think about like why are we still want to develop the seafloor, it's like who's we, right? I think there's a actually very small cadre of people pushing this, very small. And they have big voices. One of them was the former Secretary General of the ISA, who was supposed to be neutral in that role, and very much was accused in many forums of being pro-mining. The other ones are CEOs of these companies that stand to make a lot of money, whether or not mining ever even happens, and definitely whether or not the minerals are ever sold successfully. And I think that I've been getting a little testy with journalists recently about like asking that same question. I'm like, well, I don't know. Did you trace that statement to the source? I bet it was one of three humans that said that. It's really, and just as context, at the ISA, we're in this very unique position where everyone from China and Russia to Greenpeace is saying we don't want to mine right now. If you start talking about what is a moratorium? It's both there's no regulations and the science isn't there, and we're not sure we need it. So if we get to a point 25 years from now, there might be a smaller coalition of folks saying we don't need to mine right now, depending what happens with metals economies and depending what happens. The science isn't going to say that there's going to be no harm. But, right now, we don't have any of those pieces. So we're in this very unique, who is saying push, push, push? Many states are saying, like, I don't know, let's keep developing the regs. I want to keep testing equipment. These aren't necessarily like greeny kind of states or states that are very concerned about ocean health, but they're also not ready to move forward like this because no one's even going to insure it right now. So kind of thinking about why would we push? It's like exactly what Whit said, because some humans stand to make a lot of money no matter what happens. And then I think just to back up, and I'll try really hard not to give a history lesson about something I don't know that much about, but Whit mentioned something very interesting, which was like when UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, was signed in 82 but negotiated, through the 70s. And there was this idea that from my vantage point in this world right now seems so pie in the sky, but I was assured that people really, there was like this zeitgeist of we are going to create this. There are these rocks, they lay on the ocean floor. There's nothing down there. It's a desert. We're going to pick them up and we're going to share the benefits of this mineral resource to lift developing nations into parity with developed nations. And it sounds like okay. But, that was the idea. And at first, there was no privatization. It was all going to be a commons only mined by an organization called the Enterprise, which was a set underneath the United Nations. And there was no private contractors allowed. That got negotiated very hard to the point that like a 1994 agreement came, which, to put it not very elegantly, like gutted all of the idealistic provisions of UNCLOS and made it very corporate friendly. And one of the countries that really pushed for that was the United States. Surprise. And then they didn't ratify anyway. So that's where we are. But this idea, and so I think that when we're talking about what can we do, there are a couple of things. One is like support these indigenous voices that are coming from all over the world. There's a big alliance forming in the Pacific. There's been a lot of meetings, a Pan-Pacific alliance regarding ocean health. But there's also people from the Haida Gwaii tribes, like on the Northeast Pacific, so the west coast of Canada, came to the ISA this time. The Sami people in Norway are talking about seabed mining. There are people in India talking about seabed mining, elevating those voices, but also kind of reminding folks about how far we've come from the intent of UNCLOS. And I think also having hard conversations about, Whit alluded to this, there's no pie to share. The ISA has spent a lot of time negotiating how to share the proceeds of the royalties that are going to be paid to the ISA, like a lot of time negotiating this. And only now are they starting to have negotiating sessions about like, we need to make sure there's at least X amount of money to share before we authorize this. Because if we're going to share $600,000 between all the countries in the world, why are we doing this? And kind of having those tough conversations about reframing this. Like, there's been questions asked about if you don't mind the seabed, you are taking away from me as a landlocked country proceeds that I'm due from that. So how are you going to replace them? So I think, taking that question seriously and engaging with it, but also kind of level setting about that never actually materialized. Like the world isn't what we thought it was in the end of the 70s. The seabed isn't what we thought it was. It's connected, it's full of life, it supports life, there's ecosystem services. The Reverend mentioned carbon cycling, all of these things, kind of reframing that and really kind of um I was asked at a panel at the ISA by a Pacific Islander, like, tell me how this isn't neo-colonialism for you to tell me what to do with my seabed. And I said, like, wow, that's a really great question. And I would never presume to tell you what to do with your seabed. I would just suggest that you ask if your country is going to benefit from this at all. And, wonder like who might actually benefit. And I was like, that's a great question to investigate, right? And I think kind of it's hard to be in that dialogue without, I can't make these decisions. I'm not an ISA member state, but just really arming folks with the facts to ask the right questions and think about, like what was saying, who's actually going to benefit from this.
So we've mentioned some great resources on this call already in terms of places where our listeners can go to get more information and to stay in the loop as things progress. We've mentioned Pacific Blue Line, talked about the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition. If there are any other resources or places that we should turn Please be sure to share them with us, whether by unmuting or popping them into the chat. I do also want to point out that there was another question by somebody who may not have caught your slide, Bobbi-Jo. The question says, how is deep sea mining not the lesser of the two evils, land mining versus ocean? I know you got into a little bit about the differences between the two as well. So as we get close to the 30-minute mark and we start moving toward wrapping up our Q&A session, I do want to leave those both on the table for you both to talk about land versus deep sea mining again, and also next steps and great resources.
I'll quickly answer. I think the answer about lesser evils is twofold. One, there's absolutely nothing that suggests that like opening up seabed mining would at all alleviate terrestrial mining. And in fact, there's been some scholarship, including some commissioned by the International Seabed Authority, that says like there's also a scenario where there could be kind of a race to the bottom if prices actually did drop, and we've seen that that doesn't. It's not that the if seabed mining were to actually happen, it's not that all of a sudden the worst terrestrial mines would go out of business. They would probably just cut even more corners. Also, the effects to the seabed are unknown, vast. The areas Whit mentioned, like the vast area, and I hope you can speak a little bit more to that. And the fact that, when you mine the seabed, you only mine like the top. You don't go down at all. There's no minerals down. So it's literally, if it's 500,000 square kilometers, that's what's going to be mined. And seabed mining companies love to talk about how there's no human to be displaced, but people across the world have come and said, like, this is the place of my ancestors, the seabed matters to me. So I think, it's one, a false equivalency, and two, wouldn't replace it. And I would say we just don't need to open up a whole new extractive frontier where it's going to be hard to monitor and impossible to fix, say scientists.
Yeah, that sounds great. There isn't too much more I could add to it. I mean, I think I guess two things, small things to say, just because I glossed over it on my slide, but in that kind of comparison of terrestrial and deep sea mining, it's kind of crazy in some ways because, as I mentioned, one of the key issues is that we just don't really know enough of what's happening in the deep sea, and therefore, one of my pet hates is assumptions. Is that most work is based on assumptions, and trying to drill down into them is really hard. And if you actually drill down into some of the life cycle assessments that have been done, basically they don't really know enough to do a proper comparison. But also our colleagues at Planet Tracker, who pointed out the restoration issue, also pointed out a point that I love, which is basically, in trying to do a comparison between terrestrial and deep sea in order to say how great terrestrial is, they basically mapped the area in 2 dimensions, because mostly that's what you're doing in terms of biodiversity and environmental impacts on land. But of course, in the sea, what you're actually talking about is the water column above. And if you actually try and map them, in 3D, then the impacts are far greater. And it's these sort of conceptual leaps that you need to do in order to make it so difficult to do the comparisons. So I think we definitely need to bear that in mind when moving forward. I'm happy to share a few resources, put a couple of things. And I was going to say, Bobbi-Jo, you put a resource page together, which is great. I do a quarterly update, which is primarily aimed at financiers, but I mean it's pretty much useful in general, and it's so every 3 months kind of gather together the key bits of information and send them out, and actually has a resource section on it, and I'm working on a bigger resource section, bringing that together. But if anyone's interested, then please, I'll drop my email into the chat. Happy to add you onto that as well. And yeah, just great to get people focused and supporting the campaigns where they can, especially as it's going to definitely hot up over the next year or so, I would say.
Thanks. And I'll also drop my email in the chat, and I'll say that I often email around resources about various aspects of this. If you're interested in the finance or the human rights things, so feel free to reach out to either of us. And Whit's quarterly updates are great. I listen to all the same things as him, and then I read the update. I'm like, oh, I missed that. So definitely recommend. And I am happy to send around whatever might be of interest to folks and make connections as well if there's someone you want to talk to that is an expert in some aspect of this.
Right. And just to say, I mean, I think having said it's going to get kind of hot over the next year, I mean, it's going to be a very interesting ISA meeting now where a lot of those the key battles are kind of going to be fought, but also, and again, I suspect there'll be lots of kind of petitions and focus around that. But I mean, particularly around the metals company, I mean, both in America, there's likely to be, campaigners, as Bobbi-Jo mentioned, potential to input into their their and impossible metals applications, potential legal action. But I think one thing that's really important to mention as a kind of signing off is I can't remember whether I alluded to it or not, but basically the whole way this is going to work in the sense that it would only work for the metals company if they had completely American supply chains and partners and investors and insurers, because basically the US is going against the customary law, as was mentioned. The arguments I don't think will stand up, and the Letitia, the ISA Secretary General herself, has written a brilliant, I will find the link before we go and post it if we've got time, but a brilliant retorts to it and explaining why, or any country that signed the UN Convention on Law of the Sea, or any actor within it, basically, will be breaking international customary law if they collaborate with this, and there will be legal actions as a result of this. Particularly in Switzerland at the moment, there's been a lot of pressure on the main partner of the metals company, which is Allseas. But I'm pretty sure that in countries all over the world, there's going to be opportunities for people to try and stop this happening.
Thank you both. Oh, wonderful. There's a wealth of resources going into the chat, which I'm going to save and send out to everybody who registered for this webinar. And I'll add them to the description of the video once we have it up on YouTube as well. So even folks beyond those who are able to join us in the Zoom room today will be able to get those great resources. Before I pull up my final slide and with a final note for us to end on, I just want to thank you both one more time, and Reverend Bhagwan as well, for his contributions, for being here, for sharing of your expertise, for taking us through the broad overview and the drilling down into more details. This was really such an informative and inspiring webinar, and I'm so grateful of you for giving your time and expertise to us tonight.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
All right, and with that, I'll pull up my last slide as a final thought for us to end on. My first ask for folks on the call, if you or anybody that you know is in Nice for the Ocean Conference, please share this invitation to join us for the Faith in the Ocean side event. This will be a panel discussion on the multi-faith call to action that we're calling Faith in the Ocean. It will be on Wednesday, June 11th from 3 to 5 p.m. local time at the Anglican Church, Holy Trinity Church. The address is up on your screen. During that event, you'll get to hear more about our faith-based mobilization to protecting the ocean, and we do have a call out to raise awareness about deep sea mining and the importance of stopping this harmful process in its tracks. You can read the declaration as well at the bit.ly link or by scanning the QR code that's up on your screen. And just for fun, I threw in a photo from the Blue March in 2022 as well. We were also calling for an end to deep sea mining. So on that note, I also want to share some parting words by author Helen Scales. She shares, "The deep sea will never run out of things for us to dream about. Places will remain unseen and unvisited. Fleeting moments will be missed, and nimble creatures whose existence nobody can guess will keep slipping out of sight. We need to do all we can to keep it that way." And with that thought in our hearts, let us go about our days increasingly committed to ocean protection. Thank you, everyone.